We'll wait just one more minute here as people are filing in at the 2 o'clock Central Time. Well, I think in the interest of everybody's time, we will get started right now. Welcome everybody to the April 10th ACC Washington update on behalf of the Advocacy Committee. My name is Kevin Spitz. I'm an aviation supervisor in Mead and Hunt's Chicago office. I am my vice chair. TJ, you can go to that next slide. Is Allie Fields from CMT, also located in Chicago. Our young professional liaison is Amanda Sheridan from McFarland Johnson. Michael Higton was our chair last year. He's with A19 Strategies. As you see, our Chad Nixon with McFarland Johnson, who's joining us to speak a little bit later on, is our board liaison. And then TJ Schultz, who I'm sure you all know, is our staff liaison from ACC staff. So there is a ton going on with the Advocacy Committee as we look forward to FAA reauthorization 2023. But I think just talking a little bit about what we do on the Advocacy Committee, it's a little bit more than just looking at legislative affairs. We also try and advocate on the regulatory side as well. That means trying to take positions on things with the FAA in particular. We've talked about trying to make some grassroots effort with the FAA to try and learn their policies and how we can affect change from that side of things, and also different things that we can be advocates for within our companies and within our sister organizations, such as AAA, ACE, and a lot of the different areas that touch aviation. Advocacy is one of the pieces from our board that has been stressed. One of the 3 items from the board that have been stressed, and we're really excited to be a part of this committee and be able to push forward some of those advocacy efforts. As you can see, advocate, contribute, monitor, communicate, train, and then create. We're still working on putting on programming for the rest of the year that are going to accomplish some of these goals, including discussions over what a revamped Washington 101 might include. I know that during COVID, we had a Washington 101 online. If you look back a couple years before then, we had one in person, and the goal is to try and have another one in person during this year, hopefully on Capitol Hill. We have to work on the timing of that and where it fits in with the legislative schedule. But I think there is a thought that in the late summer, early fall, there might be an opportunity there, but we also will talk about the limitations that we might have depending on where we are legislatively as we look into the 4th quarter of the year. But we'll get to that in a little bit here. Move on to the next slide. So with that, I want to introduce Allie Fields once again from CMT, who's going to talk us through a little bit about fiscal year 2024 budget and appropriations. Go ahead, Allie.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, we wanted to run through some of the updates since this group last got together. So the first thing is that at the beginning of March, the Biden administration did propose their budget for FY2024. They proposed at funding AIP at $3.35 million, the authorized amount. They did really in this budget proposal act like FAA reauthorization was not an issue, right? And moved forward at what it's been reauthorized at in the past and didn't propose any changes. We do expect to see that FAA may put together some proposals this month and get them up to the Hill on FAA reauthorization, but that wasn't part of the budget request. They did propose to eliminate supplemental AIP for the year, as well as any earmarks. And we saw this in a couple of areas where the administration, I wouldn't worry too much about this. The administration's proposals across the board for USDOT oftentimes proposed cuts in areas with bipartisan support in order to plus up other areas. And so they did propose getting rid of supplemental, even though that's had really strong congressional support. Instead, they proposed a big plus up for FAA operations, as well as FAA facilities and equipment. They recognized a great deal of need in air traffic and nav-aid equipment, as well as an increase in air traffic controller salaries. So that was really the emphasis of their FAA budget request. Simultaneously, now the House and Senate are moving forward on their own appropriation processes. We've seen the request deadlines for different programs come in March and early April. The House and Senate are both moving forward, assuming that there will be earmarks this year and taking requests for that supplemental account. So again, a sign that that's not going away. The House majority has made a lot of statements about wanting to pass their spending bills this summer on time, individually, by regular order. And so the biggest barrier to that happening really is this need to deal with the debt ceiling and get a deal with between the administration and both parties to move forward in some way, whether that's lifting it through a clean bill, which the House Republicans oppose, or implementing some strong spending cuts, which is going to certainly impact the appropriations process this year. And then finally, the big update that the nominee for FAA Administrator, Phil Washington, withdrew from consideration on March 25th. Did not have seemingly the support needed to move through the process in the Senate and get out of the Commerce Committee. The administration hasn't announced any plans for how they plan to move forward. Both Senate Commerce Ranking Member Ted Cruz and House Transportation Chairman Sam Graves have expressed that they'd really like to see the administration nominate Billy Nolan, who's been in the acting role. Whether that has a positive or negative effect on his chances remains to be seen, but I'd say that we're probably months, not weeks away from having a confirmed FAA administrator, which certainly is a challenge as we move through FAA reauthorization, which Kevin will talk a little bit about next.
Thanks, Al. Yeah, it's a lot of information. Appreciate that quite a bit. Talking about FAA reauthorization and where we're at with things. And so right now, we talked a little bit about this. The House and the Senate are going through hearings right now. And so they call in witnesses. And these witnesses are usually on a specific topic. So some of the topics that the Senate's Commerce Committee has been having hearings on: strengthening airline operations and consumer protections, the FAA NOTAM system failure and its impact on national airspace, strengthening aviation workforce, enhancing consumer protections and connectivity in air transportation, among others. In the House T&I Committee, they've been having hearings on aviation safety, the future of general aviation, the comprehensive passenger experience, and then the evolution of flight, which had a lot to do with AAM and drone activities. So I've been listening in on a lot of these hearings as they've been going on, and I just want to share a couple takeaways from what I've been hearing from these. It's always important to understand that when we talk about FAA reauthorization, there's a lot of different stakeholders. I know that a lot of times here in Airport Consultants Council, we have a tendency to just think of things in terms of airports, but FAA reauthorization covers everything, as was mentioned, from the passenger experience to last FAA reauthorization, which talked about size of seats and pitches of seats and incline and stuff like that, all the way to everything as far as safety and the NOTAMs, all that sort of stuff. So as far as some things that I think are interesting to us as part of Airport Consultants Council, there's a debate going on about the use of leaded avgas versus unleaded avgas and what it's going to happen at federally funded airports. We have seen one federally funded airport that the community decided they no longer wanted to provide leaded avgas at that airport. And then there's some discussion between both sides, Republicans and Democrats, about whether that should be allowed at federally funded airports. A lot of discussion right now regarding changes in general aviation entitlements. For the longest time, $150,000 is what our general aviation friends get. And the idea is it's been like that for a long time without an increase for inflation. And there's some desire to have especially larger GAs get a larger amount of entitlements. And that's part of a package that AAAE and ACI put forth that depending if they were able to get funding above that $3.35 billion mark to about $4 billion, that they would ask for changes in the entitlements to GAs. Workforce development seems to be very important to legislators. Some panels have focused directly on workforce development, but others usually have at least one witness who is there to discuss how workforce development is affecting their particular niche in the industry and what changes we might be able to see. And that's one of the points that ACC has also put is an emphasis on workforce development and keeping together some of those boards like the Women in Aviation Advisory Board. Safety. Every single one of these hearings talks about safety. Safety seems to be the name of the game, especially when we look at some of the issues that we've had with these near misses at airports across the nation. Expect to see safety being put at the forefront of anything that we do within FAA reauthorization. And so I'd also like to talk a little bit, I attended and Allie attended also the AAAE ACI Legislative Conference a couple weeks ago. And we got to hear from legislators, actually 8 legislators in total, talking just about what they see as we move forward into FAA reauthorization. So once again, I'm going to stress that they all stressed safety. And hopefully some of us took part in SMS Industry Day that took place 2 weeks ago now. Then also they talked about that the goal is to provide stable and predictable funding, and they're going to try and do that through a multi-year reauthorization like we saw in 2018. They really do not want us to have to go through continuing resolutions, and they understand what that means to the industry if they do. One question that I'd like to bring up to the group, and if there is any comments, would love to hear from you, is there were some airports from the AAAE side and ACI side that were concerned that they've been hearing about this idea of a gap year, that there's supposed to be a gap year between design and construction. Has anybody in our membership been hearing that from the FAA as a concern?
What exactly do you mean by that, Kevin? Are you saying that they want a year between when you design and construction? When you
exactly, that the FAA wants up to a year between design and construction so that they can fully review these plans and the grant and have everything in order before they put the construction grant out.
Kevin,
so something the
specifically heard that from some of the airports.
Correct.
In the room, and it was more than one. So there were airports, plural, that were. And this is the first I've heard about this concept of a gap year or some kind of, I guess a time frame between design and construction.
Yeah, so I'm just curious on our side if others have heard this and how realistic this is. But that is something we heard at the conference from the airports asking the FAA if that was policy or not.
It seems to vary by ADO. There's one airport that we work with that they don't call it a gap year, but they do on their ACIP, they do request that the design grant and the construction grant for capital projects be split into 2 separate years, with the construction grant following 1 year after the design grant.
Interesting. Has anybody else had that experience? Okay, so I think this is something that we should monitor and discuss and see if there is action to be taken on, but just was kind of curious to see if we're seeing that on our side of the industry as well. So moving back, talking about what else we heard regarding FAA reauthorization. Representative Garrett Graves said that 500 ideas were given by Congress as to what should be in FAA reauthorization, another 14 ideas, 100 ideas from industry. So the committee goes through all of those recommendations, and that's what they're doing right now, and that's what they're going through these hearings and doing. And then Representative Sam Graves says that the goal for a draft bill is to be released by the House by July 1st, and he expects that there will be a draft of the Senate bill to be potentially out before July 1st as well. Garrett Graves stressed that this is supposed to be an iterative process and that once those bills are released, there will be opportunity for constituents and organizations such as ours to comment on them. And we'll talk about that a little bit more with our guest panel as we come up here in this meeting. And interesting enough, Sam Graves mentioned that he fears that there's going to be more differences between the Senate version of the bill and the House version of the bill than there will be when it becomes between the 2 parties having disagreements with the bill. So we'll have to see what that means. We'll have to see which each proposal of the FAA reauthorization bill looks like, and if there are different parts of each one that we agree with more than another when they come out in the next couple months. Some other takeaways from speakers from those meetings is that there is support for expansion of the types of projects eligible under AIP to more closely align with PFCs. That's especially on the House Republican side. And I know that's something that we put into our goals as well. So that's a pretty good thing. It looks like there is some appetite for some organizational changes to be sought after at the FAA. And then moving on, we talked about the tiered entitlements, and that there's an understanding that AIP funding is too low at $3.35 billion. But of course, as we look at the current Congress, the talk was that the money does have to come from somewhere, and the question is, where's that money going to come from? And it's your guess is as good as mine at this point what that's going to mean. PFCs, though, is almost for sure a non-starter in this reauthorization. We heard it brought up at some of the hearings. Some very nice questions were asked about it, but when you talk to legislators, it does not look like PFC increases are going to be part of this reauthorization. So I learned, and maybe some of you guys knew this before, but that there's a difference between authorization and appropriation. And I think Senator Rick Larsen brought this up. Sorry, Representative Rick Larsen brought this up in a really good way. And the way it works is this: is that the FAA reauthorization creates the bucket, and then the appropriations committee has to fill that bucket. So they can authorize an FAA up to $10 billion if they want to, but if appropriations doesn't appropriate that $10 billion, then the bucket's there, but it's only filled up to where the appropriators appropriated at. So I thought that was a really good analogy, so we have a better understanding of the relationship between appropriations and reauthorization. Interesting enough, and this was one that I hadn't had much experience with as well, at least of being an issue, is that there was a thirst for both lawmakers and the airports that were in attendance at the meeting that FAA staff actually returns to work in office. Apparently that's been an issue for some people, that that having them not being in office, they've been hard to track down and things have been going slower. And it sounds like that is an issue that legislators understand, and that might be coming to a head as we move forward as well. And then just one other bill that people might not be aware of that was brought up was the Good Jobs for Good Airports bill. And that's a bill, as far as I understand, is to require all jobs at federally funded airports to be at a minimum $15 minimum wage. This bill is not supported by AAAE and ACI, but it's being sponsored by Senator Markey from Massachusetts and was introduced last June. And he actually brought it up in this most recent hearing that I just watched. So it's not supported in the House, but it is being talked about, and it'll be interesting to see where things go with this. Another bill that has come up recently is HR 346, which is the NOTAM Improvement Act of 2023. It happened, of course, after the NOTAM outage in January. And it is to create a task force on the NOTAM system and how things can be changed. It was passed by the House and it's in the Senate Commerce Committee at this time. A couple other things that just to touch on is that we know that sometime after June, we are going to hit the debt ceiling at this point, unless legislators act. That's not the same as a government shutdown. That just means that the United States government is not allowed to borrow beyond that ceiling. Right now, we're already into a situation where they're trying to do extraordinary measures and they're trying to figure out different ways to pay for things. But they said, as far as that goes, that by the time we get to June and the summer months, at some point, those extraordinary measures run out. We'll have to see how legislation goes with that as we move forward into the later spring. And then funding for the government ends at the end of September of 2023. That's the same time that the FAA authorization runs out, is September 30th, 2023. In a shutdown, federal agencies must discontinue all non-essential discretionary funding until new funding legislation is passed and signed into law. And essential services continue to function, as do mandatory spending programs. Air travel, if you guys recall, about 5 years ago during the 2018-2019 shutdown, air travel was strained as a result of air traffic controllers and TSA agents working without pay. So this did not stop, but they ultimately worked without pay for what ended up being a couple of weeks. Travelers faced longer lines as some TSA agents just stopped reporting for work and the security checkpoints were closed, while the absence of 10 air traffic controllers temporarily suspended travel at LaGuardia Airport and caused delays at several major airports. And that, I like to say, sort of forced the hand of lawmakers once the public got wind of that, and the budget impasse ended shortly after, during that shutdown. So with the idea that the FAA authorization ends at the same time as the funding for the government does, if neither bill were to pass, the idea that we believe with the ACC Advocacy Committee is that the Office of Airports would shut down at that time until there was a reauthorization. I don't know if we expect that to happen. I will say that looking or listening to lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, they both really want to get an FAA authorization bill done. I know I came out of it feeling pretty heartened that that we would get an FAA reauthorization bill done. There are some wins that are against us here, but I think that there is an appetite from both sides of the aisle to get this done. As far as a spending bill goes in the budget and how that ties in with the debt ceiling, your guess is as good as mine. There's a lot of different factors at play with a split House, Senate, and executive branch. We will just have to see how things play out. Finally, as far as FAA reauthorization goes, the FAA actually puts out their proposal as well, and we're expecting to see what the FAA's proposal or ideas are on FAA reauthorization is sometime this month, is what they said. So we'll stay tuned and see what that has in store, and we'll take a look and report back to the committee as we get there. With that, I'd like to pass this along to Amanda, who's going to talk a little bit more about the, I should just show really quickly. So this is the reauthorization process, and it's a good graphic of showing how kind of a bill becomes a law and looking at what's going to happen. And both are going to give off their sides of what they think the draft bill should be. They're going to have to discuss in conference how to make these bills the same, and then they're going to have to pass it. And then all this has to be done keeping in mind that President Biden, obviously a Democrat, will be keeping tabs on this, and they have to sign the bill into law. So I would think at that point, his signature would be most likely a rubber stamp, considering that the Democratic House controls the Senate side. But we'll just have to see how things go. And we also have to remember that we need to become part of this process once we at least see these draft bills, hopefully by July 1st. So then I'm going to pass this on to Amanda, who wants to talk a little bit about ACC's reauthorization priorities. Go ahead, Amanda.
Thanks, Kevin. Hi, everyone. And I know you guys have probably heard me talk about this a few times, so I'll be quick. But we did submit a letter from ACC to Congress in February, and that letter included 4 main topics that we are focused on for the FAA reauthorization. The first and largest is AIP reform. So increasing AIP funding, revising Buy America requirements, Section 163, and addressing grant timeliness, which I think Kevin already touched on every single one of these. The next is PFC reform, which we know that we're not going to get an increase, but even just reviewing the eligibility process and the PFC process. Next is environmental issues. So additional funding, increasing eligibility for VAIL, funding research, and providing assistance to airports for PFAS. And lastly, we talked about aviation workforce, which is funding education, outreach, recruiting, internships, as well as the Women in Aviation working group and the youth access to aviation jobs. And if any of you guys didn't get a chance to see that letter, you can always just shoot us an email and we can send you a link to it.
Thank you, Amanda. We still are trying to procure some meetings with staff on both the House and Senate side. And we'll see if ACC has a chance to get in front of some of those legislators or legislative staff to see if we can give our opinions a little bit more in detail than the one pager that we did send to Congress. At this time, though, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Matt Reiffer. Matt is the Vice President of Infrastructure Programs for ACEC, which is the American Council of Engineering Companies. He's the association's primary lobbyist on all federal transportation issues, including roads and bridges, aviation, rail, and transit matters before Congress and the administration. We also have Allie, who's going to talk a little bit about her experience with advocacy, and then Chad Nixon, our board liaison, is also going to be part of our panel to discuss through some of these things that are coming up with FAA reauthorization. But first off, Matt, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it, and thanks to TJ for the invitation to join you. It's great to be together and collaborative. ACEC and ACC are really hand in glove on FAA reauthorization priorities and activities, and we've been collaborating really closely together, as well as you saw, with ACINA and AAAE as well on the airport infrastructure stuff, so that we can, to the extent possible, really speak with one unified voice on behalf of the clients and the consultant businesses that are doing the work. I'd also reiterate a point that Kevin made. We are obviously focused on airport infrastructure in the context of FAA, but there's a lot of other stuff going on in that space. I joke with people, our stuff is easy and relatively straightforward when you're talking about policy, and really does gain a lot of bipartisan support on the stuff that we want to do. It's whether we can move this whole big plane forward rather than get caught up on some of these other issues that are complicated, and I would suggest higher profile than the stuff that we work on. But in terms of the priorities that the legislators have, if you're talking about safety, security, and the passenger experience, the stuff that your firms are working on behalf of your airport clients is critical to that, as well as the air traffic control facilities and equipment and those sorts of things that a number of firms also work on. So yeah, really looking forward to continuing the partnership. I know we're gonna have I'd love to have some Q&A and speak to the stuff that you guys want to hear more about, but really appreciate the opportunity to join you.
And please, if anybody out there listening has any questions, add them to the chat and we can get to them as our time allows as well. Matt, I know that in the letter that ACEC sent to Congress, just really quickly, it talked about drone operations by engineering companies. And I think that's something that maybe ACC didn't highlight in our letter, but it's important to engineering companies. Can you speak a little bit about that part of the letter?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, I would say just personally and professionally speaking, it's one of the more interesting topics that I've had the pleasure to work on, and it's just absolutely remarkable how quickly the technology has been developed and implemented and continues to advance. And when you're talking about unmanned aircraft, I mean, as our letter indicated, what seemed futuristic just a few years ago is now pretty commonplace in the A&E world in terms of the types of services that our members are providing, utilizing these machines and these technologies. The FAA did a pretty good job years ago getting that initial regulatory framework in place. And so there's a basic set of rules that everybody is really familiar with. But my sense is when I hear from firms and I look at what the capabilities are now, it's becoming more of an impediment. The existing framework to me feels like more of an impediment, and the FAA ought to move faster on things like beyond visual line of sight and other regulatory changes to really integrate more drone utilization into the national airspace. Keeping in mind, obviously, the airports and other operators' concerns about safety and interference and so forth. But if you're talking about surveying, mapping, construction site monitoring, wetlands mapping, as well as the bridge and building inspections, I mean, there's just a whole range of things that we can do a lot safer, a lot more efficiently, with an incredible amount of accuracy. And the existing regs need to be updated. And so we think the FAA reauthorization could be a point to undertake some of those advancements in unmanned aircraft, as well as you mentioned, just advanced air mobility generally, whether you're talking about air taxis or others. There's a lot of interest in this within the committees of jurisdiction. So I think there's going to be some provisions related to the new and emerging technologies.
Yeah, listening into the March 30th hearing, it was amazing hearing some of them speak about where we're going with advanced air mobility, but then also the issues with trying to integrate that with the national airspace and how that's all going to fit together. And some things that maybe some of us don't think about as far as low-flying aircraft and how that fits in, whether it's in an agricultural setting or things like that. So it'd be interesting to see where things go. But certainly it seems to me that legislators are very keen on emerging technologies and want to discuss where we're going with these emerging technologies. It's really important to them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about what can our constituents of our companies do? And so how can just a normal run-of-the-mill engineering company worker getting engaged with the FAA reauthorization effort?
Yeah, it's a good question. To the audience on this webinar, the first thing you do is just show up and pay attention, which is what you're doing. So, kudos to you for being involved and engaged and informed, whether it's ACC or ACEC programs, just being aware of the current dynamic from a legislative or regulatory perspective. And looking and hearing and learning about ways where you can make a difference. And when I spoke earlier about speaking with one voice, no one's expecting any of you individually or your firms individually, to carry the load. And the associations work in coalitions and in partnerships with each other, but bringing your unique voice as business leaders, as constituents, as folks who are working on projects back in their districts, just looking for those opportunities to raise awareness, to build familiarity with your legislators, whether they're on the committees or jurisdiction or not, understanding what the issues are that are in play and the opportunities that could be advanced, if our priorities are met in the bill.
Allie, I know you've got a unique perspective of things, having come from Capitol Hill over to CMT. Kind of the same question to you. How would you suggest our constituents getting involved with the FAA reauthorization effort?
Yeah, I'd just echo a lot of what Matt said. I'd say, other than being involved in the broader things that ACC is doing, I think of it as two layers, right? One is ACC is doing this on behalf of everybody across the country, and then any individual company, individual person can make a big impact on their own elected officials, right? And so, not calling the Speaker of the House and saying, "Can I have a meeting on behalf of ACC's priorities?" But when you're on the other side and you're a Hill staffer, you're certainly going to make time for ACC, for ACEC, whatever it might be in terms of stakeholder groups. But when it's a constituent back from your district, the emphasis is on definitely making time to hear that and hear that message be custom to the part of the country that you're working on behalf, right? And so I think really helping to hone in that message to what the local impact is based on your own personal experience within these broader priorities that we're talking about for the profession and the industry is really, really helpful in building that kind of groundswell for all members of Congress.
That's great. Chad, you have a unique perspective as well, being a company leader. What kind of things do you try and do as yourself and perhaps on behalf of your company?
Well, kind of answering the question, third place here. A lot of good things have been said already. Sure. But I would say the thing that is always the most effective, in my opinion, first of all, numbers are important. So if you happen to have a business that's in that person's region, talking about how that impacts your business and means X number of jobs. Also, the person on the other side of that desk is translating in their head how many votes that is in their district, and how many people those people know. So I mean, those things are important to hear numbers. The other thing I think that is probably the most important thing you can do is bring it home. You need to describe what is going to happen at your local airport, and be specific about this. In my area, it might be, there's going to be significant delays if we don't get the grants in a timely fashion. And you're talking about taking a construction project and extending it when it could happen in 1 year and making it 3 years. Maybe in our backyard is Corning Glass, who's a frequent user of the airport, or some hospital system that's a frequent user of the airport. Those folks may look for another state to go to because of this lengthy delay and how it's going to hurt their business. Those kinds of things really catch their attention. So trying to bring it home and talk about what's going to happen to their constituents, to their taxpayers, what kind of pain that they're going to suffer because of whatever those rules or regulations that are being proposed are. I've found that to be the most significant difference maker when I'm talking to folks.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Chad, we'll go back to you right here so that you can get the first crack at this next question here. So what ways have you had success in engaging? Are we talking writing a letter, emailing, calling your Congress people? What do you typically do?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's a bit old fashioned or not, but to me, a face-to-face meeting is almost always the best way to do that. Face-to-face can be a little different now. I mean, this is effective what we're doing here with virtual meetings. So, and I would say that maintain that relationship. So don't always go to them when you want something. Go talk to them when you don't want something. Just tell them about, hey, this is what's going on in our world right now, in our district, and things like that. Or if they've done something that's been helpful, talk to them about that. So I would say maintaining a relationship, however you do that, whether it's through video, virtual calls, or going down there, maybe plan out to do that twice a year, and if you could get down there for a face-to-face, that's great. Or talk to your regional representatives. Those folks do have a direct line to the elected officials in DC. So that also works, those regional representatives. But maintaining a relationship is the most effective, whatever that looks like.
Matt, from your experience, how often is too often? What's the right number of touches that you should have in a year with your elected officials?
Yeah, it's a great question. I reiterate what Chad said about building relationships. We've talked a lot in the A&E industry about being trusted advisors for our clients. And I tell our members in the advocacy space, we want to be the legislators' trusted advisors on policies, on legislation and regulation, so that they value our opinion. And if you build that relationship to such an extent that they're coming to you with questions and ideas rather than you flagging for them, hey, this is going on, or we're encountering this thing, and we need your help. So that's really, the end goal is to get to that point. In terms of frequency, I think it depends. They're incredibly busy people, staff and legislators. They're a mile wide and an inch deep on so many issues on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. So being frequent enough to cut through that noise, but being intentional and cognizant of the dynamic, and not being overbearing, I think is the kind of balance that you're trying to draw. But in a year where FAA reauthorization is a big congressional to-do item, I don't think it's out of bounds to be more frequent than you would be in a sort of off-season type of environment.
Interesting. Allie, when you were up on the Hill, what was the most someone contacted you and you said, that's enough, I can't take it anymore?
That rarely happens from actual individual stakeholders. I mean, I think there are definitely lobbyists in DC who do that, and you get used to it. But I would say way more frequently, is it the opposite, where folks only reach out the minute of the vote where they need something, rather than taking time to make that relationship. And so I wouldn't worry folks about that. I will add to what Chad was saying. I mean, another great thing you can do is invite members to come drop by your office, right? And come actually meet some of those other people that are part of the work that's happening in their district. And that's another way to kind of build up that relationship on top of the times when you need to call and just update on something or send an email asking for their support on a priority.
And one of the things I guess I didn't realize, but then you kind of hear it with these hearings, is that these legislators, they seem to go home probably almost every weekend or so. And so they actually are in district a little bit more than you might realize. Matt, is it better to be reaching out to them and trying to come visit them in Washington, D.C., or is it just as effective to try and schedule a meeting when they are back at home in their home district?
Yeah, my preference and recommendation has always been in district meetings are much more effective, because you're going to have much more dedicated time and fewer distractions. When they are in DC, they're triple booked at any given time of the day, with committee hearings, House votes, caucus meetings, and all sorts of other priorities and things that they need to attend to. So their time and attention is very, very limited when they're in DC. That's not to say that it's not valuable. But yeah, they're every member of Congress and most of their staff are all frequent flyers, and they're going in and out. So there are opportunities to see them, even at the airport property. If you've got a project, or facility that you want to draw their attention to, whether something that's ongoing or just completed, that's a great opportunity to grab them while they're there. I'll guarantee you, all of the airline lobbyists all have them on speed dial, so we ought to be in that position as well.
Yeah, it is amazing how in tune these legislators are with aviation efforts, because they all are flying, like I just said, on a weekly basis. This is important to them that we get these terminals right and these airports right and keep safety, because they're the ones using the system almost more than any of us here. And so let's talk a little bit about how agencies such as ACC and ACEC fit within this framework. I mean, we're all members of ACEC or ACC here, and probably a lot of us are in dual roles of also being members of ACEC. So when we go and talk to a legislator, are we talking on behalf of ourselves? Are we talking on behalf of perhaps ACEC and ACC, or how does that work? I mean, who are we trying to represent when we talk to a legislator? Matt, if maybe you want to start, and then we'll go back and through Chad and Allie, you can answer that one as well, how you feel about that.
Yeah, I think it depends on the context and the issue at hand. But for the most part, I think we're all speaking with one voice, and there ought not to be any inconsistencies in the messaging. There may be a level of specificity that individual member firms are bringing to bear on particular projects, but I mean, the value of participating in these associations is us helping you, with talking points, background materials, one-pagers. I will often hear it's a two-way street then. So we will push out our advocacy materials, and equip our firms to have those engagements, particularly when it's timely, and whether that's an action alert or a fly-in or a roundtable opportunity, in district, we'll provide those materials. But what often happens a lot is hearing from members that say, hey, I have an opportunity to see this person at, the Rotary Club or the local chamber event, or I'm going to this town hall, or if it's a political event, a fundraiser, and do you have something I can give to the congressman when I have a chance to see them? So we want to take advantage of those opportunities as well, so that, again, we're all speaking with one voice, and we can equip you with what you need to deliver that message, and then just bring it home locally.
That's interesting. Okay, so Chad, when you go and you've talked to your legislators in the past, do you usually say who you're representing, or you're just Chad Nixon kind of going as a professional engineer on his own?
It's kind of a mixture. I agree with Matt. One of the nice things about ACC and other associations that we all work with is they kind of have this overall message, and then myself going down there and talking to them, I then get specific about, like I said before, what it means to our particular area. Otherwise, you'd have to do a lot of research, I guess, on your own to try to understand, what all those overarching issues are. The one other thing that I will say, and Matt kind of mentioned this on the periphery, is just sheer numbers. So when you talk about this, ACC represents companies across the country that have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of employees that work for those companies, that all of these topics are important for, so that's kind of the way that I discuss the role of ACC and other, AAE, ACI, whatever, as part of that.
Allie, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I agree with everything Chad just said. I typically, my kind of script opening a meeting, right, is Allie, I'm with CMT. This is a little bit about how CMT sits in your district. We're members of ACC. We're members of ACEC. And here's some of their priorities for FAA reauthorization. Let me tell you why a couple of these are really important to me, and particularly should be to you, right? Why they apply in your district. And so given that context of who you are and the organization that or the company you're a part of, the firm you're a part of, but then reiterating that you're a member of ACC, ACEC, that you're interested in the priorities of ACI, whatever it might be, then helps them go back the next time. There's just one more layer of recognition about these organizations being that trusted expert in DC on these priorities.
Mm-hmm. Matt, going back with you, can you take us through the process of when do you reach out to ACC or your other sister organizations and say, hey, we want you to sign on this letter with us. We want to become a unified voice versus kind of going it alone. Is there a process to that, or just as needed, or how do you determine that?
Yeah, it depends on the context. In There are schedules and cycles from a legislative standpoint, that we're all sort of used to. And obviously we're in a 4-year, 5-year kind of FAA reauthorization cycle. So starting last year and then in the first half of this year, I've been in close contact with TJ and our counterparts at ACI and AAAE, because I knew that we were all going to be reaching out, conversing with our members, getting input, and identifying what our priorities were going to be. And to the extent that there was crossover and that we could be unified on, a set of issues, that's really helpful. And then there will just be things that just kind of naturally come up in the course of a year, or, legislative ideas get proposed, or there's rulemakings from FAA that you need to be reactive to, something that you didn't plan, but you're made aware of and have a stake in. And that's when these sort of ad hoc kind of, partnerships pop up. DC is a small place, and the transportation world and the aviation sector is even smaller. So we all kind of know each other. And there's relationships professionally there that we sort of figure this out and pull teams together as an as-needed basis. So it's kind of a mix. It kind of depends on the issue, whether it's that regular cycle or whether you're responding to some crisis or proposal that's problematic.
Kevin, I would say also that, ACEC and ACC, we are in alignment with AAAE and ACI 90% of the time.
Sure.
There are those very specific business issues that we get into. For example, in past FAA reauthorizations, we've sought provisions that help to increase the utilization of qualifications-based selection for professional services beyond just the AIP programs. We've had, in other modes, we've had discussions about overhead rates and caps on overhead and things like that. I think we're also very mindful of beneficial and fair contract terms as well. So I think that's something that's unique to us, and it's specifically ACEC and ACC, and that we really are kind of the business component and how you all run the business and procurement regulations. And that's something that we specifically advocate for.
Makes sense.
And to the extent that we can help ACI and AAAE on the stuff, those 90% of issues where we do agree, it makes those 10% outliers easier to kind of navigate in a professional way. They may not like what we're doing, but it doesn't have to be vitriolic.
Understood. Let's talk a little bit about the sophistication level of some of the staffers and the legislators that we're talking to. So first of all, if I say ACC to them, are they going to understand what that means? ACEC, does pretty much everybody understand those? Or I need to go as far as kind of explaining what these organizations are and what they do?
Well, I hope everybody knows what ACEC is. Speaking for myself, yeah. So definitely, it's going to depend. The members on the committees of jurisdiction develop an expertise on those issues, and their staff, develop working relationships that are with the stakeholder groups, including ACC and ACEC. So certainly there. Members off of the committee, maybe less so, but it will also depend on what facilities they have in their district. There are members with very large airports in their districts who may not be on T&I, but just spend a lot of time on aviation policy because of that presence of that facility in their district. I mean, they're outside of GA. I think that's probably a little bit different, but most members will know ACEC. And I think more importantly, for the groups on the folks on this call, they ought to know the employers in their district and the businesses that are doing the work. So even outside of the airport property, the consulting firms, the engineering firms and advisors that are there, they have an important piece of that from an economic standpoint that they ought to be familiar with.
We had a question come in. Do the staffers in DC understand the issues better than regional staff? I've heard that's a reason to go to DC is for an issues discussion. Do you have any sense on that, if that's true or not?
I would say, yeah, I'd love to get Allie's perspective on this too. I think it depends on the office. So most offices are structured where you have, legislative policy staff in DC, and most of the staff in district are constituent representatives who are helping folks kind of navigate, whether it's an immigration issue or Social Security or some other sort of thing, where they're interfacing in a liaison role with a federal agency. But the district office director tends to be more politically savvy, will often have, at least some familiarity with what's going on from a policy standpoint and how it impacts the district. But they're really the sort of face and that liaison to district, community, organizations, and representatives. It's really, when I talk about meeting with them in the district, it's more about meeting with the member while they're in the district, not in district staff.
I see. Allie, was anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. In a good functioning office, there's a lot of dialogue back and forth, right? If you meet with the district director in a congressional office on a transportation issue, they're going to be telling the transportation staffer in DC. Even in a really good operation, there is that game of telephone, right? And so back to your point, Kevin, about do they know ACEC, do they know ACC? Yes, probably, but when in doubt, spell it out and ask them how familiar they are, right? Because I think that does do a lot to reduce, especially if you're talking to staff who's new to the issue or their district staff and they know some about what you do, but maybe they don't know what, Part 135 means. The more you can just help them out and not put them in the position of having to ask and just say, are you very familiar with aviation issues? Is this something you've heard a lot about? It helps level set so that you're not kind of explaining something they already know, but you're also not leaving them hanging to, try to spell out an acronym they have no idea what means and lose something in translation to the member or to the right staffer in DC.
That makes sense for sure. So as we head towards the end of our hour, I want to reach out to all the people out there. Is there any questions anybody has that they want to share in the chat, or you can jump on, go off of mute and ask? Otherwise, I've got one more question. While you guys are thinking of your questions, I just want to know, are there some success stories you've seen about growing a relationship with the legislator? And that's really for Chad, if you've had that experience, Matt, if you've seen it with some of your member firms, or Allie from either side, any success stories that you've seen?
Related to what specifically, Kevin? I'm sorry.
I suppose just seeing growing a relationship and perhaps becoming a trusted advisor with a legislator, or seeing a piece of legislation that was passed due to a relationship, or anything of that nature where you've seen some success in this field of advocacy.
I can say things are a little more difficult to connect the dots on in DC. Did one relationship or one advocacy effort, really move the needle? Yeah, I mean, every member has a vote from that perspective.
Sure.
But also, my time in New York, also, Senator Schumer was and is pretty powerful. So that relationship certainly helped in different ways. But I can assure you, I mean, I've been involved in that through the New York Aviation Management Association up there. Did that for a long time, and you could absolutely see it at the state level. We got a program for upstate New York airports that was around $200 million, which is still ongoing. That was absolutely through the efforts and relationships that we created there, and trusted advisors. We would bring that, as I mentioned before, this is why it's important for your little airport in your region that you fly on, back and forth to wherever. So I can definitely say that. The other one is Real ID. We're working in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania had a program where you had to opt in for Real ID as opposed to, you had to opt in rather than opt out. Most states for that, when you went to get your driver's license, you had to say, no, I don't want a Real ID. There you had to say, I do want a Real ID and I want to spend the extra $35 or whatever it was, right? So we had some relationships there and really worked closely with the with the state trying to change that, because that was one of the ones where we actually teamed with the airlines on that. American Airlines, for example, said out of Philadelphia, 70+% of their traffic were people that flew only once a year. Those are not the kind of people that want to spend $25 extra or 35, whatever it was. So yeah, I mean, definitely having those details and creating those relationships pays dividends through a lot of different things that ended up helping, our organization and companies like ours.
Matt, do you have any stories like that?
Yeah, one comes to mind. There was a congresswoman in California who for years was very close politically with the Public Employees Union within Caltrans. It's called PEG, the Professional Engineers in California Government. And for those of you who may not work in California, Caltrans does most of their engineering design work in-house, and they've got a massive engineering workforce within the public agency, and they contract out very, very little work to the private sector. And it's just an ongoing political issue. And so this congresswoman for years was sponsoring amendments on various transportation bills that would mandate insourcing of professional services or restrict and put severe, guardrails around the ability of public agencies to contract work out to private sector firms, which is a threshold, problem for us and a key issue for us. So we spent a long time meeting with her and with her staff and the member firms in California, getting her to understand the value of the services that we provided, the economic impact of the businesses in her district, the scope of work that we were doing for a wide array of public entities there, and the challenges that those ideas that she was proposing, the constraints that they would have on businesses in her district and in the state. And we also engaged with her politically on the PAC side, and all of that effort has paid a tremendous dividends. She has stopped doing that. We're one of her first calls when issues come up. She's a leader on the T&I committee, particularly in the water sector now, and it's a very, very close relationship. But it took a long time to kind of steer that ship in the right direction, and it was all due to grassroots engagement through ACC California and the member firms there on that education campaign to make sure that she understood the full picture of what it takes to deliver projects there in California.
I think my main takeaways from what you just said there, though, is grassroots and time. And in both of those, you got to get started today and reach out and start building that relationship for both that grassroots effort from all of us and that time that it takes to build that relationship.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank Matt for joining us today. Chad and Allie, thank you for answering some questions as well. We really appreciate all three of you being a part of our panel today. I hope that everybody got a lot out of this. Moving forward, we continue to follow what's going on with the FAA reauthorization. And this is some of the things that we've done on the ACC Advocacy Committee as we look forward to where things are going to go over the next couple of months as we get closer to reauthorization. Like I said, we're going to take a look and see if we can try and get some meetings with staff on both the House and Senate side as we move forward into the summer here, and continue to monitor legislation and keep up to date with that so we can disseminate that information to you and to also keep tabs on what that legislation is going to entail. So with that said, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I really appreciate you all being here. If you ever want to talk more about advocacy, please reach out to me at any time, kevin.spitz@meadhunt.com, or reach out to me through LinkedIn. Join the Advocacy Committee LinkedIn page as well. We'd love to have you. If you already knew about the advocacy page, reach out to another person in your company and tell them to join the Advocacy Committee as well. We'd love to have anybody join in and be a part of these Washington updates. So with that, thank you so much for attending, and we will see you next time.